The topic that we're going to cover today will be what's the appropriate role for technology in a company that practices value-based recruitment. I will turn it over to you two, and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Good to see you, Charles.
Hello, Fred. Great to see you again. Thank you, Shannon.
So I think we're supposed to both introduce ourselves, and then I'll cue it up, and I think we start with you. But you want to do a quick intro yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hello, and again, thanks for joining. My name is Charles Lilly, and I work in KPMG's HR digital transformation team. KPMG, of course, professional services firm, providing audit, tax, advisory services across 100 plus countries and territories, 200,000 plus employees working globally. I'm based out of Chicago and support the US firm.
That's awesome. I'm Charles' new friend, Fred. I'm Fred Goff. I'm a co-founder and CEO of JobCase, a social media site dedicated to empowering workers. We're a place that people come to network, to get their next step, whether it's a new job or whether it's career navigation to move forward. And we got this really fun topic that Peter queued up for us about values-based recruiting and how to leverage technology for that. What's really interesting about that is how you go about defining what values. And so that was really where Charles and I started, and how we're going to frame this conversation for you all today, because it can be the values of a company trying to identify a subset of potential candidates that have those values in sync, so you get a great fit for your company. So cultural values and how you use technology to do that. Or there can be values about the individual person or even society as a whole, and how we leverage recruiting technology to accomplish that. And I think Charles and I both have advocacy for both of those approaches, but we spend our days kind of on different sides of it mostly. And so I think what'll be interesting is Charles, if you could kick us off, because I think you've done such an awesome job at KPMG of really leveraging technology and trying to also stay abreast of current trends in terms of, amongst many things, making sure you find the cultural fits for values with your own firm. So I think that'd be a great way to kick it off if you want to do that.
Sure. No, that sounds great. Yeah, I guess there's obviously, Fred, like you said, there's one of many definitions of values-based recruiting. One of them that comes to mind for me is, how do you embed your organization's culture into your hiring process? So, obviously one reason why you'd want to do that is you're looking for a way to really communicate, articulate what your culture is. You want to align candidates with roles where they can be successful. So you're trying to find that match, of course. From an HR hat side, you of course want to improve retention. Boost employee engagement. So I think that's definitely one aspect you can, we can talk about for values-based recruiting. And I guess in terms of a little bit about what that means to me personally. So in my role, I'm very, I support our talent acquisition technology. So I'm very focused on, again, this is for US. So I'm focused on, what are the technology solutions that we're deploying, making sure those are successfully deployed. Those line up with our future roadmap and our goals. So those are all things that, day to day that I see that are, that we were working through.
And why don't you talk a little bit about, before we jump into broad values, some of the things that you're currently doing on maybe some of the campus recruiting and how you leverage some of the new technologies in terms of trying to find ways of looking past degrees and skills to cultural fit. I think some of those diagnostics might be interesting.
Yeah. So, I mentioned this term, HR digital transformation. So what that means for us is, we're looking at, yes, there's several different phases of going through what is the transformation and what are you looking to achieve and accomplish out of it. So, I think first you have to look at, what are your employees saying? What are your candidates saying? What does the job market look like? So you want to carefully look at all these different things to figure out what are the correct solutions. We're talking about technology. For us, obviously, even pre-COVID, but even obviously more so now, there's a need to move to a virtual experience. So what's kind of front of mind for us is how do we deliver a best-in-class virtual recruiting experience? So how can we apply technology that facilitates engagement? It's an innovative experience. while at the same time, you're still communicating your own organization's values through to your candidates. Like that message is still making it through. They're able to hear it, they're able to understand it, they're able to experience it through whether if it's a recruiting process. And something we've been very conscious of is, of course, like many organizations, we have, we have goals that we're trying to achieve. So, if we're thinking about how can we accelerate diversity within, with our employee workforce, how can we improve and re-energize our workplace so that employees are more engaged, which of course, obviously we're a business. So, that's going to tie into our position in the market. So winning the market, of course, is important as well. So if we're looking at one of the areas that we're really taking a close look at and spent a lot of time is looking at our university recruitment. So we're reinvigorating that process. We're making that, like I mentioned, it's going to be a mobile enabled, a virtual process. And also, how do we keep candidates engaged with that? So, obviously we're applying technology that'll make things expedited. So if there's some things that are, maybe they're repetitive tasks that we can take off of a recruiter's plate, of course, trying to, centralize some of those things, which allows a recruiter to be able to do, what they do best, build people relationships and maintain those, identify candidates. But, to your point, Fred, like one of the things that, we've talked about is one of the things we're excited about is we're applying a gaming component to our application process. So our next recruiting season for university recruiting rolls out in the spring. So something we're excited to launch is where we're embedding this additional component into our process to make that more interactive, to really, and it also gives an opportunity to learn more about the candidates who we're talking to. So we're very excited to do that. That plays in our whole digital strategy about how do we, what's the right level of technology, what's the right level of automation, and how do we apply that to the recruiting process, and really it's to really kind of set ourselves apart from what are maybe some other folks doing in the market.
Charles, how do you guys how do you measure success with that? So is there success about your use of recruiting automation as you're describing it? There's more candidates you're able to see in a less time, or is there success on other metrics of fit that you're measuring? Because it all sounds like really cool and good. I really like the gamification part that you're doing. But I wonder, when you look back, especially being KPMG, right? You look back a year from now, I'd expect that you guys are extraordinarily good at thinking about looking at success metrics and holding to account to then adjust. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so no, those are good questions. Of course, there's definitely has to be a component of data and analytics. So if we can't track what we've been doing, and how do we define what is success, what we're doing, how do you know how you're doing, right? So it's going to be a multi-year approach to be able to define, exactly what that is. And like anything, there's maybe not a get it right, the first time you do it. You have to constantly monitor and adjust things that you're doing to make sure that's successful. So things for us, we're trying to, specifically from our university side of the recruiting house, is where we're looking to, to broaden our reach to university students, gain additional exposure, identify, more diverse talent. So we're really trying to cast a wider reach to really open up the candidate pool. As far as long-term success, we're applying measures that, there's your recruiting brand, then there's your actual employee experience. So we need to make sure those things all line up as well. So for instance, if you're going to assess your candidates on one set of metrics or points, but then those are things that maybe they don't see once they walk in the door, or virtual these days, log in for the first day. Those things have to all line up. Otherwise, there's kind of a disjointed process, and it's really kind of an inconsistent and non-contiguous experience for someone who's going through the hiring process. So it's going to be a constant reflection on is this all playing together to meet the outcome that we're looking to achieve.
Got it. So I have a question on that, but I feel like when I take a few minutes and frame outside of cultural values, other dimensions of values, when we talk about value-based recruiting and how to leverage technology for that, you think that makes sense?
Yeah.
Don't need to filibuster, but I can frame a few things. When we think about workers in general, and I think it's really important that employers go the extra mile, like KPMG is, to try to find the right fit for their organizations, because cultures can vary. It doesn't have to be one's right or one's wrong, but finding a good fit is going to increase those downstream, really critical factors of retention and things of that nature. When we think about it from the worker perspective, it's around the entire arc of what they're having to do in this future of work. It has to do with trying to make sure that they are respected, that technology isn't throwing them in a black hole problem we all know about, where they get sorted and nobody gets back to them, and et cetera. It's where they're treated with people first, but it's also in a way that allows individuals to get feedback loops, to get information, to have co-ownership of their data and what's being processed, so that they can then help navigate to success as they define it. When you go from the micro level of each individual person being empowered, and how technology and recruiting and processes and technology in general can support that individual person, then you're able to have more of a macro impact. And most of what we'd see is it's not about technology, but the philosophies and policies companies implement around that, or even the ecosystem around companies. And so I'll try to land that more specifically a little bit. I think that when we're increasingly as a country understanding better systemic racial injustice that's been here for a while. I think we're increasingly becoming aware of economic injustices that are not sustainable for long term, and increasingly learning as a country about the need to try to address these. I think that's all very positive, and has that focus has increased with energy and clarity in coronavirus year of 2020. As we look to figure out, okay, what do we do about this though? How do we move forward? There are very specific things that recruiters can do. There's very specific things we can do when we harness technology for recruiting. When we think about technology, to keep this on track for Peter, and how that translates through, one schema I have is around, well, there's AI, there's machine learning technology, and then there's just actually the pipes and technology itself to make the connections. Each of these can be leveraged in different ways by folks in this room, or your clients or your vendors. And each can be a force of good or a force of bad. If you have job descriptions that aren't scrubbed for unnecessary degree requirements, you are going to eliminate huge pockets of the population that can do the job amazingly well. You're going to eliminate huge pockets of population that happen to not have access to FAFSA, or not have access to the ability of getting to colleges, simply by nature of where they've come from, not by nature of what they can do for your organization, right? And that tends to hit people of color more. That tends to hit a whole series of populations that your company probably is expressly saying you're trying to bring into your company. But you can start by what is in these jobs. The next one that we're all aware of is when you start to put in some of the machine learning algorithms to increase the efficiency of your recruiting process. And if you're focused on cost per hire or cost metrics, you can easily trip into a problem of having biases in the data that are now going to be reflected and reinforced throughout your organization. So these trips, these things that can really empower you, can also cause a huge problem to workers and to have societal impacts. AI in particular is one that can really run amok. And it also can be inadvertently disrespectful, I think. If you have somebody raising their hand to fill out an application and go through, like Charles, your whole gamification process, and say, I'm willing to spend most of my waking hours on behalf of KPMG, I mean, don't we at least owe them a human to take a look and say thanks or no thanks, or give them a feedback? So I think how we harness this has implications for how we want to think about society and how we want to think about the individual worker. But to make that work, there's two things I think that realistically on the ground level, as we leave, theoretically, we'd all like things to work better. We have to land the ROI, right? We know that when companies truly understand that if they want to serve a diverse world in B2B or B2C, they have to have a diverse workforce, that then we start to see change in organizations, not just trying to balance numbers. We know that when there's true authenticity about understanding that your customers and your employees are the same in terms of, like Walmart, they're going to work there, they're going to buy there. So therefore it's in your interest to move forward and have people that can help the bottom line when you treat them well. That closes the loop. And so I think bringing back this around on recruiting technology, and the question for you, Charles, is I think the metrics and where you land is just so important because it can guide the choices of whether you're like harnessing technology to displace a task or displace a job or do things like this. So when I think about your success metrics, and I'll tee you up here with a question, I think that there's, in my construct, kind of a crawl, walk, run when we come to recruiting technology and companies. I think the crawl is, how do you use technology to increase the breadth of your funnel? In a really good way, how can you increase it to expand the funnel so that you can get in alignment with individuals or even societal goals of DE&I processes? And do you measure that on cost per hire or things of that nature? Did you get that done? That's one level. I think the next level that becomes really compelling, but also has an ROI to it, is when companies can stitch that together with retention metrics. When you can say, okay, that's nice that they came in the door, but are people succeeding and still here 91 days later, 120, forget about even years. Can we just get past a meaningful onboard, right? And then I think the third one that we would love to see, and I think where labor markets need to get to, but it's probably a little bridge too far in 2020, but maybe not in 21 or 22, is can we go past retention to say, we know that we now live in an ecosystem where labor has to continually train and get educated and retrain. And if success is onboarding people that also will have a pathway within your company in terms of past retention of 91 days, but getting to the next job. And so did we get from the funnel to a hire? Did we get from a hire to keeping? But did that person actually matriculate to the next job? And by the way, whether within a company or outside, but was this a good step for them? That to me is run when the whole system starts to work better for the labor marketplace. But having stated kind of that foundation and backdrop, thanks for indulging me on a different way of looking at values and that. That's when I look at success metrics, because I think that when we're out here in the ecosystem of talent acquisition, it's really hard just to get to a cost per hire. It's really hard even to find out the attribution of when we advocate in communications and social boards and et cetera about our members, which part of that activity helped to get the hire done, let alone going downstream to retention when you have to get outside of an HR ecosystem into the rest of the company's ERP. So I'm wondering from your perspective, how far down is it? Do the success metrics to go? Do they at least get to retention? Or if not, I presume you subsidize that qualitatively with conversations with hiring managers or follow-ups or something. But love to hear how you think about success beyond just the funnel and the hire.
Yeah, no, and you brought up a lot of great points, Fred. I think one side note what I was thinking while you were talking is just even everyone has a hard time just defining what is the definition of cost per hire for one. So like even just that's going to be different for different organizations. That's not even a metric that, there's not a set, this is exactly what that is. People kind of can define that. There might be a variation of that from employer to employer. But I think one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking also is, if you're thinking about applying technology and you found, you're like, okay, here's a great events tool that, we like, we'll implement that. And then maybe we have a CRM, maybe we have an ATS. And if we have things that are, they're kind of somewhat disparate, then we have our onboarding tool, then we have our performance tool. If there's not a holistic view to see what's success in this part of the process, what's success in this part, but like just the bigger picture, what is overall success? That can be tricky to do if you're applying technology, because often you're often going to have different tools that do that. That's not going to be one system. So there's not maybe one easy way to track things through that whole process. So that becomes more complex. It does offer some opportunities to, maybe there are ways you can apply, if it's not, systems integrations, but if it's things like, can you apply automation? So if you could think of like, maybe there's a potential to apply some technology there. But no, those are all great points. I mean, if you're not able to, if you're doing all these things really great, like if you're doing fantastic at being able to track, like if it's a recruiting event attendance, but then we don't know what really happens with people after that, is that successful if you're not actually hiring these people? So it's being very thoughtful about, for one example is if you're gonna be applying, I'll bring it back a little bit to values-based, if you're thinking about what are the values that are important to us and how do we find that? If you're thinking about the experiences that as someone is touching each of these different technology tools that you have throughout the employment life cycle, whether it's pre-identification, I am browsing the career site, maybe have attended, I don't know, an online, online event, or, when we get to the point where it's an in-person event again, if it's an in-person event, whatever the case may be, how can I take a step back when I'm thinking about what's the right thing to do, as a recruiting organization, as an employer, to say, what are the values that are important, and as a recruiting team, are they able to articulate those, communicate those, and do the actual touch points that we have along the way, do they fall in line with what those values are? So I can give you like one example is that, if integrity is something that's one of our core values that, that we live by, how do I integrate that into like these different points of the process so that maybe an easy example is like if it's recruiting, maybe you make that as transparent as possible to your candidates so they know exactly what to expect. You have clear expectations. They know what the next steps are. They get, if it's an automated communication, they get that when it's appropriate. When they get a human touch point to interact with them, it's appropriate. So it's being very, when you curate these different pieces of the process, be very thoughtful about like, think about like, what do you want that experience to be? Because that should be in line with your overall, your overall goal too. But I think, obviously at the end of the day is you're trying to, any employer is trying to find what's the most efficient way for me to attract the candidates that align with my organization who will be successful. And and also the reverse of like, how do I find those people? So where are those people? So there's no easy answer. There's no one answer for every employer. It's gonna be very different. You have to do a lot of research, and you're not gonna get it right every step of the way. It is something you've got to like constantly watch to make sure that you're that you're trending in the direction you at least want to be headed towards, right?
So here's what I love about the early part of this as we frame kind of this conversation for this gosh, do we call Zoom a convention, this panel, whatever, is I feel like there really is two questions. That one is, what values are you recruiting on? And then two, how do we hold technology to be consistent with that? And how do we leverage it? On the values, what I like about what I'm hearing that you and KPMG do, and I wonder how many dimensions of it, is you know what they are. I mean, that's simple, but I think there's a lot of companies you can say, hey, what values do you have? And if you ask 5 different people, you might get slightly different answers. So it sounds like when you say integrity, that did not sound happenstance. It sounds like you have very defined values that you are searching for in your recruiting process that align with KPMG. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Something that we've been very, very thoughtful of is, we've been looking at ourselves as an organization, asking questions of our people, of our professionals. And also carefully thinking about like, okay, what are the values? Like, what do we value, and how do we measure what that is? Then how do we find more of that? And how do we live that also? So those are very, that kind of plays into our whole, I mentioned transformation earlier, that plays into the whole process of, how do we transform, and move forward as the labor market changes, as the economy changes, as all these things change, all that's going to kind of morph with it. So it's not as easy as saying, okay, this is going to be like one metric that we look at the exact same thing for the next 5 years. That could change next year. But it's something you've got to pay conscious attention to.
And do you think of the recruiting process itself and how you leverage recruiting technology to just be, well, I don't mean just, to be a reflection of that? Or do you have a complementary set of values for that operation as well? In other words, you can say, here's these 5 principles of KPMG. Integrity is one of them. We're looking for people that match with this. And then you might say the process of recruiting, we want to make sure that people are communicated with individually, or et cetera. You might have another set of values that are separate, or you just think about, no, be consistent with our values at KPMG through this process. Wondering if it's the same set or a different set.
Yeah. It's holistically, it's the same, it's the same core set of, values that we're demonstrating through our recruiting process, that we're looking at candidates, and then, we're making that a connection between, the onboarding and employment experience as well. So, it's a conscious effort of, being consistent with that communication. I think that huge deviations from that, again, like that could cause you some gaps like that. If that's something that's significant, that might present some roadblocks. If these things are kind of operating somewhat in a silo and they're not totally matching up, that might be okay, well, I learned and perceived X, Y, and Z was going to be my experience at a company through the recruiting process. But then once I started, 90 days in, I'm seeing that it's not really like that in my team. Like, how did that disconnect happen? So it's another opportunity. It's a touch point. If you're collecting information, whether it's, I mentioned surveys, like we do a lot of surveys, we ask a lot of questions. So we do a lot of research on people who go through our interview process, whether they get an offer or do not get an offer. We collect a lot of feedback and we listen. So it's not easy. It's not easy to do, and it's not easy to decode. But at least it gives you some place to start, and you can figure out, like, okay, like what I'm hearing. Maybe I'm hearing different things from different populations I'm talking to. Like, maybe candidates are saying one thing, maybe employees might be saying something different. Like, how do I kind of pull all these things together? And I think if you're to direct to the topic of our talk is, how can I apply technology to help me do that? I think it's a careful balance between 100% automation and I have the human interaction that's still left in, like this talent acquisition and these HR functions. Like, how can I make this alleviate, maybe it's a recruiter's, day-to-day workload? How can I take some work off their plate so that they can focus on, what they do well? So if they're going to be interacting with people, how can I'll just use a very simple example, like maybe it's, scheduling interviews. If that's something that I'm spending 30% of my time scheduling interviews, when I could have been spending that time going out and building relationships, developing relationships with candidates, those sorts of concepts. That's obviously a great use case for automation. But that's an easy one. Like we could arrive at that just by, talking through it. It's if you can take that another step further and apply additional automation, that maybe if you're looking at things that, if it is kind of we'll talk about, like, if it's like an AI type of concept where it's learning, does that give you additional help to maybe better hone in? Like, how do I identify candidates? Maybe that is through, maybe I'm assessing folks, and how does that compare with, the people who I have within my organization who are successful? So those things all have to kind of line up. So it is something that you do have to spend a lot of time researching and being able to figure out, exactly what is the right balance between all those things. And it's not the same answer for everyone. It's going to be different. So it's going to depend on, I think it kind of comes back to your culture. So, like, what does your culture dictate is, kind of the right balance of, this is 100% self-service. This is something I 100% deal with through, maybe it's a chat bot. What does that mean for you? I think that is something that you're going to have to look at, what is important to us, and and try to get it right with applying these different levels of automation.
So I'll offer a thought, and then we'll tee up a Q&A that's supposed to happen next.
Sounds good.
I think the way that we look at it, Charles, and the way I process really interesting things you're saying is, recruiting, when we talk about recruiting technologies and value-based, I think recruiting, it's like the handshake in a long-term relationship. And so when I hear how you have, it sounds like some really compelling vendors, and we know of a lot out there that are allowing you to try to assess in a very short time frame, is this person a good cultural fit for you? And like gamification, because you're trying to get to different inputs than traditionally just asking someone to interview or that. So I'm presuming that over time it's going to be more proficient, and you'll see that prove out in retention metrics or something downstream that works. Mm-hmm. That's really the perspective that I think that that when we talk about recruiting technology and values-based, I feel like the conversation blossoms in both directions. I feel that where we live today, there's an awakening going on in capitalism. When the Business Roundtable a year ago actually states it's about stakeholders, not shareholders. Now, mind you, very few lived up to that statement, but there's companies like Delta who didn't just do a shareholder buyback, they did a windfall bonus to their employees. And there's companies like JobCase who then celebrates that. We told all of our members to fly Delta, not just work there, because if we can reward good employers who treat their workers well, other employers are going to have to, because they're going to be competing on a P&L and their margins are going to drop if they don't. So I think a lot of this moment that we're in, that hopefully becomes a movement with regard to economic justice, with regard to racial justice, with regard to a lot of things, is going to bring more societal values into corporate values that are being searched for. And the metrics of success, therefore, are going to be throughout the organization, not just the hiring funnel, not just whatever's in the recruiting technology, but to go beyond it. And in particular, we're in this, it started with Anil Bhusri and Workday and how awesome they were for starting to gather actionable insights and big data for HR groups. And that's allowing companies to ask questions and have the data, exactly what you're saying. How can you actually have a really good D&I program unless you can have anonymous surveys or such, right? You can't have a CO with my demographic as I look, born when I was, right? A white veil and et cetera. And I can say, don't worry, yeah, our company's great on D&I. Really, are you sure? But now we have these metrics and these companies that offer the ability of getting to the data that allows us to. And so I think as we open up Q&A, I'd encourage anybody who has questions. When we talk about value-based recruiting, I think a successful recruiting operation gets you a match that's a successful employee. And to define successful employee, that employee is moving the needle for your company, not just over a short period of time, but a long period of time. And I think where we're going as a country and as an economic system, cultural values in society and respect for the individual are going to increasingly be demanded by the labor force to be reflected in individual companies' activities. And with a lot, I'm presuming at KPMG, you probably already have that, but with others, it's going to be a good movement for it. So as I turn it back over and step aside whatever questions, I would encourage them that anything that carries through beyond technology to success within an organization or values, either culturally or within a culture of a company that you're trying to fit, or other ones that are important to a recruiting group for what they want represented in their labor force, is fair game for us to talk about.
Absolutely.
Well, like Fred mentioned, we're going to get into the Q&A portion of the conversation. We do have a few pre-submitted questions. Our first question is going to come from Clayton. Clayton, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Hi, I'm Clayton Kearns. I'm the president of MinnesotaJobs.com. And I'm curious, who gets to define values in a values-based approach to recruiting? Is it management, shareholders? Who actually gets to define those values?
Fred Goff, and Charles Lilly. The two of us will do it.
You just cook them up.
That's a really good question, Clayton. You want to take it first, Charles?
Oh, sure. I was going to say the answer is really probably all those things, Clayton, that you mentioned. I mean, it's going to be really, if you're thinking about recruiting, it's going to be, obviously anyone who's a stakeholder recruiting process, depending on your company's ownership structure, of course, that has a factor into it. Where you are within the market, if, whatever these are all things that kind of come into play with it. So I think it's thinking about what is the right, what makes sense for like what my company situation is. So I know that's the answer is like it is all those things. I think it truly is.
Well, I think I'll riff on that a little bit, Charles. I think when it comes to your company, you're going to define that, and I think it's really valid, especially in this moment when the country seems so split on many dimensions. To question, okay, who gets to define when we have my sense of the individual responsibility, and if we go to more societal values. But I'll share a diagnostic with you for how it's going to be decided, and it's we as a nation are collectively going to decide what is good. And historically, we have decided in theory that access to equal opportunity is good. That should be something that's not something we fight over, right? Shouldn't we agree wherever you're born, you should have access to opportunity? Can we agree on that? And if so, then as we learn about structural things, we realize that has not actually been achieved for huge pockets. That evidently is a still controversial statement. So to Clayton's point, there could be a difference on the evaluation here. The issue is how broad can we get principles agreed to? Because if they're not agreed to, we aren't going to have action. We are not going to have any kind of broader societal or individual cultural principles brought into companies if it hurts the company. I'll give you an example, and not to put you on the spot, Charles, but if Charles, historically in accounting firms, having grown up on Wall Street and then come over to this space, there's a competition when they come to you and you're in a bank and they say, oh, I've got all these Wharton grads, they're going to be part of the consulting group that's working with you, or all of our auditors came from Harvard or whatever. And that's kind of an arms race that was happening. If we as a society agree it's skills, not degrees, like so many of us listening to this have talked about, and think that's going to open up so much access and et cetera, then we need the clients. When KPMG comes and says, you're going to love this, we have 4 people on your team that graduated from Bunker Hill Community College that matriculated to their CPA. It's really awesome that they're here, and on and on. And when the next firm comes up and says all they have is Harvard grads, we need the client to say, yeah, the values that I want are over here. Because as much as KPMG wants to celebrate cultural values, if they can't get any clients because they're competing in a different system, then that's not really going to be something that we achieve at any massive scale, is it? So I guess I don't have the hubris, Clayton, to say I have the answer, other than say it's a really wise question. But it's also pretty obvious that if we can't collectively as society agree on breaking down, getting away from degrees, and opening up other values that transcend HR groups, that transcend the entire organization, but go out to whoever's paying the check at the end of the day, the businesses you're selling to, the customers you're selling to. If we can't get alignment there, it's going to be hard to get it through the system. I think the good news is, I think that this country agrees on the principles a lot more than you would think by looking at things today. I think that we're in a process where we just got to all have a little more tolerance and education to understand where the gaps in the principles are and how we can get closer to closing the gap between who we aspire to be as a nation and who we are. And I think that'll end up coming through in HR departments and how you leverage tech. I don't see these as a different concept, but now I feel like I'm talking too long, so I'm going to stop. And another thing.
We have another question from Stephen. Stephen, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. Oh, and welcome to the stage.
Oh, thank you. Hey, sorry about my pandemic attire. I'm Stephen Warren, CEO of Results Generation based in Austin, Texas. First of all, guys, thank you so much for sharing. This has been a great discussion. I do have a question. Can AI ever be people first, or does it always involve a human cost of some kind?
Oh, it definitely can be people first. It's going to be the greatest thing for humankind we've ever had, as long as we harness it right. Give an example. I mean, right now, so I used to do all these future of work, Stephen, and I guess I still do, but COVID, not so much anymore. And there's, I'm always called to MIT because I'm looking out my window and I see them right now. So it's easy for them to have me come over because I cross the street, I'm getting a coffee. And like 4 or 5 years ago, when they first started the future of work conferences, there was a whole slide up that talked about radiologists and their efficacy at detecting cancer, breast cancer in particular, by reading the mammograms. And my first conference there, they were saying that machines weren't as good as humans, but it's coming. A conference later, literally, you're thinking making something, a conference later, machines are as good as humans, but machines and humans together, way better than either a human or a machine. That was really exciting. Where we are now, humans can't keep up with the machines. The machines are way better at the efficacy with regard to understanding earlier detection of breast cancer. How awesome is that? That is awesome. So I think that that's an example where we're going to get this massive health breakthrough. But I think implied in your question is, yeah, but what about the radiologists? Are they out of a job? That's the whole key about how we decide, right? If you're a nuclear scientist in the 50s, are you going to decide to spend your time building bombs or powering France? If we harness AI to replace tasks, think what that does for the radiologists. They don't have to spend all these hours poring over machines to figure out what is this. They can take all that time to help with treatment, to help with talking with the human part about talking to the patients. If you look at like an ONET, what are all the skills around a radiologist? Detection of cancer is one of like 20 things. It's akin to when like a CFO in the 70s, they didn't have QuickBooks, they didn't have NetSuite, they didn't have any of this. Imagine their activities in the 70s, a CFO of a big company versus what it is today. But a CFO today, they get to be part of the strategy. They start to do M&A. They have all this stuff because they don't have to worry about all the ecosystem about these things. So it's tasks were replaced, which open up the potential for what humans can do better. So I do think that AI, and done right, is going to make free education. It's going to include the health system. It's everything. And if we focus as a HR community about how can we look at what we harness to replace tasks, not jobs, including our own, by the way, including all of us on this call. How do we harness it to replace our tasks that we don't really like to do, to allow us to do what we can do better? Then it can be really good, but it will take proactive use of it. It won't just happen. This is something that, you know, some companies are going to be thinking about people first and some won't, and we'll see the difference.
Awesome. We have another question from Peter Weddle. And Peter, don't you have a book on this very topic?
Oh, he's going to say the robots are coming to get us.
They are, Fred. They're after your job. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. I agree that a technology-based recruiting ecosystem has to promote an organization's values on one level, just to get the good cultural fit that you were talking about. But I also think it needs to reflect those values. And for example, lots of companies say, well, one of our core values is respect for the individual. And then they sit them down in front of hiring managers that are totally unprepared to do an interview and abuse them in a disrespectful interview situation, or they don't even get back to them after an individual's gone through all the trouble and work of applying. They can't even bother to send them a message saying, thank you, we got your resume. So, I think, for example, as KPMG is embarking on this gamification technology, that technology really needs not only to promote integrity, but it also needs to be designed in a way that can illustrate to the individual KPMG's commitment to integrity. It needs to have integrity part of its core design. And here's the problem. Fred, you used a couple of phrases as you were talking. We are becoming more aware and we are increasingly understanding. And I think that's exactly right. Values are not static. They are evolving all the time. And particularly beginning late last year, early this year, we're seeing a huge evolution around social justice, around global warming, around gender equity and compensation. Those kinds of things are percolating through company cultures and values on an ongoing basis. So technology takes a while to build. KPMG isn't going to snap its fingers and have that gamification technology ready to go. And so my question is, how does technology keep up? I mean, by the time KPMG gets, and I'm just using you as an example, Charles, not casting any aspersions here, but by the time you get that,
completely understandable.
By the time you get that technology built, your values may have moved, significantly in terms of where the company is on some of these really huge issues. And so do we run the risk of always using out-of-date technology in terms of ensuring that we're promoting the cultural values that are really important to the organization?
Well, I heard you say Charles, but I'll say one thing just to clarify, and I'm sure we're aligned on this, Peter. You don't need anything more than a pen and a paper to have to be the organization you want to be. I mean, the issues that you're saying that we're talking about haven't come about, whether it's an increased understanding of systemic racism, whether it's an increased understanding of gender compensation and all that. Whatever technology we need for that, we had 100 years ago. So I don't think that when it comes to some core values, now your efficacy for how you evolve and manage it, or the parameters on what you're using today is what I'll tee up for Charles. He's got much more understanding of how to manage a large organization, HR group than I do. But I just would offer that I don't see technology as a hurdle to the cultural values we're talking about, or evolution of respect for the individual values we want to be living within companies. I think that is simply a philosophy and a policy choice by individuals to say, yeah, that's who we want to be. Technology is not a hurdle on that. But Charles, how do we keep up with it?
Yeah, no, and that's a good question, Peter. As I say, just to kind of add on that too, is your original question is like, are we using outdated, is it outdated by the time we're deploying it? Like, which is a good question. I mean, that frequently we do see that with any technology. But I think if you're going to be using some sort of technology in your recruiting process, you're gonna have to be constantly doing doing this validation and looking at, so like if you are shifting, how do we measure what that shift is within our organization, and then apply that to who we're looking for. But I mean, with anything, you do have to, I'll call it a risk in air quotes, is like, there's going to be a delay in how fast you can turn that around if you're analyzing numbers, especially if we're talking about big data, things like this. Like that's, requires some thought, requires some compiling, and what is the right way to look at this data we're collecting. But I think with any, if you're deploying technology, it's probably not going to be a matter of I'm going to configure it and then set it and forget it and let it go. It's something that you're going to be, while it is improving, it's doing some level of labor for you, obviously. But while this is happening, you're going to have to track it, just like if that was a group of employees doing that, you would be tracking to see like, okay, are they being effective? Are they being productive? It would be the same thing with technology. Is it being effective? Is it productive? Is it set up the right way? Like those are things that you still have to keep tabs on that, of course.
Do you believe it's easier today with the technology you have than it was 5 or 10 years ago? Like, is it getting easier to live up to the values, however you define them?
It's a good question. I think it's different. So I think, particularly for the HR recruiting functions, I know my role has evolved, has been evolving, and will continue to evolve. I think if we're thinking about, what is that in the future, it is I know, Fred, you mentioned this earlier, is like, how do we, us being people, working with machines will be better than just the people working on their own, or just the machines working on their own. Machines, technology, bots, although I'm kind of lumping those things all a little bit together. But I think it is we'll see all of our roles kind of shift, and as we can automate or apply technology to different processes, that allows the humans to be able to rehone their skills and grow in areas that maybe a machine is not able to, or isn't as capable or reliable of doing. So if that is having a live face-to-face interaction conversation like we're doing, granted, I've had some of those with machines, but maybe that's something that you can hone in your people skills kind of thing, to use a simple term. But I think and some of that is, there's a lot of, if we're looking at automation, it is having an understanding of data and analytics, which, a long time ago wasn't as big of a factor in like the HR and technology, and talent acquisition roles, because those roles have just evolved that much as we've had applying more and more technology. At one point in ATS wasn't even a thing. So, we've come quite a long way.
Awesome. It looks like we have one question from Pete.
Well, gentlemen, thank you, Fred. Thank you, Charles. This may be considered covered ground, but it was a pre-submitted question. While the application of technology is clearly important, as we all have discussed, shouldn't employers also be concerned about the design of the technology itself?
I can take that, Pete. I think if you're going to be applying technology to to a recruiting process, or to an HR process, I think you really want to understand the underlying, like, how is this working. I think a miss is if I know this was probably mentioned in other sessions also, like a miss could be if you're going to rely on, okay, well, I've hired this vendor to do X and Y, and don't have a whole lot of input into like what X and Y is and what the outcome of that is. I think that that could be a gap. Like that could be something that's a miss on on your part. So I think like the answer to your question is like really having like a full understanding of, and part of this is like kind of upskilling your own jobs, like for if you're thinking about like an HR and a TA role, is like really understand like what is the technology that's running, it's really taking over parts of this process and running it. What is it doing, and what exactly, like, where do I fit into that? So I think it is there's a big element of like understanding exactly what these tools are doing, so that I understand how do I work with that tool, and where do I add value, where does it add value. So I think it is like kind of understanding what is the distinction. So it's kind of similar to if you're working with a group of, people, let's take bots out of the mix, like understanding this person does this person does this, like kind of understanding the big picture, but then like, what are all these little, separation of duties of like, why is this important? And I think the same thing applies to technology. We have to, and part of that is understanding like, if you're not a technical person, you're like, okay, well, I already feel like I have a gap because I don't fully understand technology. That is part of like kind of the upskilling I was referring to. I think comes into play there.
I'll riff on that real quick. I think the design, it's how the technology is used. So I lovingly tease Peter about the robot thing, but he's got a great book. If you haven't got it, you should get it and read it. And the concerns about, as he teases me, robots are coming for a job, they are in many degrees, right? Things are going to shift. It's going to shift. We just have to adjust with it is kind of the point. But when you use this technology, when you're using it to funnel out, when you're using it, even in the design of how you are trying to source candidates and where you're sourcing them from, all those design decisions about the technology you're using have biases in them. We've seen it. We've seen that there's a digital divide out there that people are ignorant of. And for years, we had a trucking company that was wondering, they had a problem in their recruiting that they kept getting men, and they were looking to have more diversity on a gender dimension. And when you looked into how, I don't want to betray that, go off the wrong thing. There were things in their recruiting process that were very biased towards why men would finish the process or not. And there are, when people are looking for different diversity dimensions, and you have a mobile app process that stinks. Look, not everybody's at a desktop computer, right? A lot of folks are filling it out here. So you got to make it user accessible. Those are things that aren't in the bias of the data, which happens to accidentally get you into a bias on AI or machine learning dimensions. That's just, how are you thinking about your application system? This goes back to that pipes I was saying, just the pipes and where you're sourcing from. If you want your values to come through, more often than not, it's not, I would encourage everyone, don't be intimidated. I can't write a line of code, not one. And I've been managing machine learning scientists in 2 different industries for 20 years. The trick often, and the danger often, is how are you leveraging it? Where are you pointing it? What data is going in? How are you thinking through the design? So in Pete, you asked a great question about design. The design has as much to do with, what do you determine success? How do you measure it? Are you really using this technology in a way that when you are empathetic about kind of almost role playing, people on the other side using it, is it going to have the impact you want? Those design mistakes or risks are the ones you are completely in control of, as anybody on this call. And whether you're using one system or another to achieve your objectives, how you choose to use it, what data informs it, what success metrics are there, what channels you go to, have as much to do with being consistent with your values as not. So I think it's a great question. I would just have people think of the design having to do with how you're using the technology, where you're pointing the technology, even more than the technology itself.
So focus on the end user, so to speak.
Focus on the end user, but with consistency of what you're actually trying to measure. Don't look at the averages. You got to look underneath the cover of just an average on a population.
Makes sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for a great conversation, great rapport between the two of you.
It's easy. Charles is awesome.
It was a great conversation. You guys definitely did not disappoint. Any closing words before we turn it over to Candy Chambers for closing?
You wanna?
Sure.
Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just say, just to bring this back to the topic, like this is something that it's not, if you're not using some level of technology in your recruiting process, you're going to increase that. So I think it's something that we're obviously going to continue to see. We did get a big acceleration of that, with the help of 2020, but that'll just continue to go that direction. And I think it is for me, it's exciting. It presents some new opportunities. It creates jobs that we didn't have within our own functions, even just a couple of years ago. But I think it is something that we also have to very much pay close attention to, learning, understanding, what are the effects of this, and how does this help or potentially hinder, if not set up correctly, our goals or processes. So I think it is just remembering to focus on, the people relationships. We're talking about recruiting, and how does talent technology fit into that mix too.
And I just say, I think everybody on this call usually people have more power than what they think. Especially you're in the HR world. You talk to hiring managers, you talk to candidates, your reach is pretty dramatic. And the more you can advocate and evangelize, put people first, tasks, not jobs, get to the right values. Can you get success metrics that go beyond the crawl of hiring costs, as important as that is? And can you get to retention? Can you get to, do they get the next job? The more that we can ask the right questions, measure the right things, and advocate to leverage technology with a human-centric view, not a human displacing view, the better it's all going to be for everyone. But everybody here can do their own small part.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you both for an awesome conversation. Like
Thank
I said,
you. Thanks, Charles. Good talking with you.
Thanks,
Guys did
Fred.
not
Great to see you,
disappoint.
Shannon.
Thank you both. And I'm going to now turn it over to Candy Chambers to close out day one.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon, and hi, Charles. Gee, this has been great. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I hope you have enjoyed the conversations as much as I have. With so many things going on around us right now in the entire world, I find it's important that we just take time and listen to one another and learn from one another and just share some good information that will make us all better. And I think today's events just provided that great opportunity for just that. I'd also like to thank the speakers for sharing their thoughts with such a broad audience. And I understand Peter had to whip something up at the very end. So good job, Peter. And to our event sponsor, Oleo, for their support in helping to host this event. So recordings of day 1 and day 2 of this conference will be available on tatech.org in the early next week. So if you're unable to attend any of the sessions, you can feel free to tune in at your convenience, which makes it kind of nice as well. And I encourage everyone to return tomorrow. We'll have some amazing topics, and you can see them right there on the screen beginning at 11 o'clock a.m. And that's 8 a.m. Pacific, so you don't have to get up that early if you're on the West Coast. And again, we'll run until 4 p.m. tomorrow. So I hope you had a great day, and I appreciate your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.